March 23, 1943. El Guettar, Tunisia. For the first time, German tank commanders are fighting American M4 Sherman tanks in numbers. And what they are reporting back to Berlin is not what Colonel General Heinz Guderian's intelligence files said to expect. The Sherman tanks advancing with the American 1st Infantry Division and the 899th Tank Destroyer Battalion at El Guettar are part of the reorganized American 2nd Corps under General George Patton, 11 days into Patton's command, and already demonstrating the specific transformation in American tactical performance that the Kasserine Pass disaster had made politically necessary, and that Patton's specific command energy has made operationally real. The German 10th Panzer Division, whose 88mm guns and Panzer III and IV tanks have been the instruments of German armoured superiority in the Tunisian theatre since the campaign began, and whose combat record in the African fighting includes the specific and devastating performance at Kasserine, a month earlier, that has given German Armoured Command a confidence in this theatre that the El Guettar morning is about to revise, is conducting a morning assault on the 2nd Corps positions in a valley that the German commanders have assessed as offering a decisive advantage to their anti-tank guns. The assessment is based on the terrain analysis that professional armoured commanders perform before any major engagement, the valley approaches that the attack must use, the fields of fire available to the defenders, the specific terrain features that will channelize the German armor and provide the American defense with the geometric advantage of converging fire. What the terrain analysis has not fully incorporated is the specific defensive preparation that Patton's 2nd Corps has been building for 8 days. The artillery fire plans, the pre-registered defensive positions, the massed anti-tank guns, whose placement has been determined by the same terrain analysis that the German commanders have used, but that has been completed in the specific knowledge that the 10th Panzer's assault route is the obvious route, and that the obvious route should be the prepared route. The 2nd Corps' own defensive preparation has turned the valley into a carefully coordinated kill zone, whose trigger the German commander has not yet realized he is about to pull. The Shermans that are part of this defensive position are not the Shermans that German intelligence has prepared the 10th Panzer to fight. German intelligence assessments of American armor through 1942. The assessments that Guderian, as the newly appointed Inspector General of Armored Troops since February 1943, is reviewing and revising in Berlin while the Tunisian campaign reaches its climax, have been compiled from limited sources, attaché reports from the pre-war period, technical analysis of captured vehicles, and published American military documents, and the specific information that German intelligence has been able to develop about American armored doctrine and American armored production from the available intelligence channels. What the 10th Panzer's after-action reports from El Guettar will add to this body of information, what they will send north through the German command chain to Rommel's Army Group Africa headquarters, and eventually to OKW in Berlin, where Guderian's revisions to German armored doctrine are being prepared in the specific context of the Tiger tank's introduction into operational service. The Panther's still troubled development, whose initial catastrophic reliability problems are delaying its frontline deployment, the Ferdinand tank destroyer's deeply problematic combat debut at Kursk, and the German High Command's disputes about how to use these new vehicles most effectively in response to the increasing Allied armored capability, is a picture of the Sherman that differs from the pre-existing intelligence assessment in specific and operationally significant ways. Not in the vehicle's individual technical specifications, which German intelligence has measured against captured examples and published sources with reasonable accuracy. The 75mm gun, the 30-ton weight, the specific armor layout whose vulnerabilities a well-positioned Panzer IV or 88mm gun can exploit. Not in the vehicle's individual performance envelope, which test evaluations of captured Shermans have documented with the technical precision that German armored engineering applies to any vehicle it assesses. In the way the vehicle fights, in the way it is integrated with the artillery and the infantry and the close air support that the American combined arms system deploys around it, in the numbers in which it appears, and the rate at which it is replaced when destroyed. These are the things the after-action reports are beginning to document. And these are the things that no static technical assessment of the vehicle itself could have captured. In the tactical context that American doctrine places it in the numbers that American industrial production has made available, and that are changing the tactical balance in the Tunisian theater in ways that the German command's prior planning had not projected as achievable at this point in the war. What Guderian eventually writes in Panzer Leader, his post-war account of the armored war's development, written with the specific combination of operational knowledge and professional regret of a man who understands more clearly in retrospect than he could in real time what the gap between his expectations and the actual campaign demonstrates, returns repeatedly to the gap between what German intelligence had told him about American armored capability and what the operational record of the campaigns in which American armor fought actually demonstrated. A gap that is not primarily a gap in technical specification accuracy, but a gap in the understanding of how American industrial capacity and American operational doctrine interacted to produce a military instrument that was qualitatively different in its operational impact from what the technical specifications alone would project. Heinz Guderian's professional relationship with armored warfare, the specific and extraordinary intellectual investment that has made him the German army's primary theorist and practitioner of mechanized warfare since the early 1930s, gives his assessment of American armor an authority that other German officers' assessments would not possess. Guderian is the man who wrote Achtung Panzer, the 1937 treatise on armored warfare, the book that synthesized British interwar armored theory with German operational requirements, and described, with a precision and an operational clarity that astonished its readers in the German military establishment, exactly the kind of warfare that Germany would actually conduct 3 years later in France, that had synthesized the theoretical work of British thinkers like Fuller and Liddell Hart, with the specific capabilities of the German military's own mechanized forces, to produce the operational doctrine that the 1940 campaign in France had validated in the most spectacular demonstration of armored warfare's potential that military history had yet produced. He is the general who commanded 19 Panzer Corps in the drive to the Channel in May 1940, who drove 240 miles in 10 days against an Allied defense that had not been organized to respond to the speed of his advance, and who had then commanded Panzergruppe Guderian in the opening phase of Barbarossa, driving from the Bug River to Smolensk in the same breathtaking pace that had defined his 1940 success. He is also the general who was relieved by Hitler in December 1941 for the specific insubordination of ordering tactical withdrawals that Hitler's no-retreat doctrine had forbidden, withdrawals that Guderian's professional judgment correctly identified as operationally necessary, and that Hitler's ideological commitment to fixed defense had made politically impermissible regardless of their operational merit, who has spent 1942 in the enforced professional obscurity that Hitler's displeasure imposed on German officers who were right in ways that the Führer found inconvenient. His return to active duty in February 1943 as Inspector General of Armored Troops comes in the specific aftermath of Stalingrad, the disaster that ended Germany's offensive capability on the Eastern Front, and that produced in the German High Command a level of institutional anxiety about the war's trajectory that had not been present since the reversal before Moscow in December 1941, at the moment when the German armored force faces the specific challenge of fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously against opponents whose material resources are producing capabilities that 1941's confident projections of a short war had not required Germany to plan against. In the period when the German High Command's recognition that the war's trajectory has changed requires the assignment of the German Army's best armored thinker to the problem of revising German armored doctrine and German panzer production for a war that is no longer the blitzkrieg of 1940 and 1941, but the attritional confrontation that the Wehrmacht's initial failure to destroy the Soviet military in the projected single campaign has produced. Guderian's assignment as Inspector General is not a combat command. It is a professional assignment to the most important institutional problem in the German military in 1943. how to build and organize and equip an armored force that can fight effectively against an opponent who is getting better, faster than German doctrine has projected, and whose material resources are producing a military capability that German production is beginning to be unable to match. What Guderian brings to the Inspector General role that no other German officer could bring is not merely his operational experience or his institutional authority, but his specific and sustained intellectual engagement with the problem of armored warfare. The decades of thinking about what tanks can do, what they cannot do, and what combination of doctrine and engineering and production is required to build a tank force that decides battles. His position as Inspector General gives him a view of the German armored forces' problems that no single operational commander possesses. He is receiving the after-action reports of every major engagement in every theater, the technical assessments of every new vehicle entering German service, the production statistics from Albert Speer's Armaments Ministry, whose organization has been transformed since early 1942 into a war production machine of extraordinary efficiency, and the training reports from the replacement programs, whose output is refilling the Panzer divisions that the Eastern Front's attrition has consumed and is continuing to consume at rates that the production statistics are struggling to match. He is also receiving, through the intelligence channels of foreign armies west, the assessments of what the Allied forces are building and fielding, the assessments that are not wrong about individual vehicles, but that are, in ways he will identify most clearly in retrospect, systematically underestimating the operational significance of the production rates, the logistical systems, and the doctrinal learning speed that transform a collection of technically adequate vehicles into a militarily decisive force. When he receives the Tunisia after-action reports in March 1943, he is reading them against this background of German armored force problems and intelligence assessments. And the Guettar report is one data point in a picture that is beginning to make him uncomfortable about assumptions that the German armored intelligence has been building its assessments on. When American armor begins appearing on the Tunisian battlefield in the numbers that 1943 is producing, it is against this intellectual framework that Guderian is measuring what the reports from Tunisia are telling him. The German intelligence picture of American armor, through 1942, is built on specific and limited sources whose limitations are partially understood by the analysts producing it, and partially not. Foreign Armies West, the German Military Intelligence Directorate responsible for assessing Western Allied military capabilities, has been applying to the American armored force the analytical methodology that the German intelligence establishment has developed through years of assessing European opponents, a methodology built around order of battle analysis, technical specification assessment of identified weapons systems, and the operational history of previous engagements as indicators of likely future performance. This methodology is appropriate for assessing opponents whose military doctrine, training standards, and industrial capacity are within the range of variation that European military establishments have historically demonstrated. It is less appropriate for assessing an opponent whose military is undergoing the specific transformation that the American Army is undergoing in 1942 and 1943. The transformation from a peacetime establishment of 190,000 men to a wartime establishment of 8 million, conducted in less than 3 years, with the specific and documented American institutional willingness to revise doctrine, change command, and adopt new equipment at a pace that European military establishments, more constrained by tradition and by the specific institutional conservatism that professional military organizations develop through decades of peacetime organizational stability, have not demonstrated. Foreign Armies West is assessing a target that is changing faster than its analytical methodology can track, and the result is an intelligence picture that is accurate about what the American Army is at the moment of assessment, and progressively less accurate about what the American Army is becoming. The M4 Sherman's technical specifications: weight approximately 30 tons, crew of 5, main armament 75mm gun, with a 300-round ready ammunition load that the Sherman's turret basket design makes accessible to the loader in a way that increases the rate of fire compared to German vehicles with comparable caliber weapons. Armor protection up to 51mm on the hull front that is thinner than the Panthers, but adequate against the Panzer III's 50mm gun at combat ranges, and vulnerable to the long-barrel 75mm of the late-model Panzer IV and to the 88mm at most practical combat ranges, powered by a Continental radial aircraft engine or the Ford GAA V8 or one of several other alternative power plants. The American production system's variant proliferation has introduced to solve the specific supply and manufacturing constraints of producing more than 49,000 vehicles, are accessible through captured vehicles, published American technical documents, and the specific intelligence that the German attaché network had been collecting before the United States entered the war. German engineers analyzing a captured Sherman in late 1942 can produce an accurate technical assessment of the vehicle's armor, armament, and mobility specifications. What they cannot produce from the vehicle itself, or from the published documents, or from the attaché reports, is the assessment of how many of these vehicles will appear on any given battlefield at any given stage of the campaign, how quickly the American logistics system will replace those that are destroyed, and how the American combined arms doctrine will integrate the vehicle's 75mm gun with the American artillery and the American close air support and the American infantry in a tactical system whose effectiveness will exceed the sum of its component capabilities. The technical assessment produces an accurate picture of the Sherman as a vehicle. Its gun is capable against German Panzer III and IV at standard combat ranges. Its armor is more vulnerable to the long-barrel 75mm guns of the late-model Panzer IV and to the 88mm anti-tank guns that are the Luftwaffe's dual-purpose anti-aircraft and anti-tank weapon. Its engine represents a fire risk from the gasoline storage in the hull sponsons that German anti-tank crews learn to exploit. What the technical assessment does not and cannot capture from published documents and captured examples is the operational context, the numbers in which the Sherman will appear, the staggering production volumes that American industrial capacity is generating in 1942 and 1943 and 1944. Numbers that German intelligence is tracking through available sources, but whose operational implication for the armored balance in any specific theater is difficult to assess accurately from production figures alone. The logistics system that sustains those numbers in the field, at a rate of operational availability that German logistics at comparable scale has not been producing, and the specific American doctrine for combined arms integration that determines how the Sherman is used rather than merely what it can do. German armored doctrine in 1943 has been refined through 4 years of combat against opponents whose armored forces the doctrine has successfully countered, and that refinement has produced in German armored officers a sophisticated and battle-tested understanding of how to fight tanks. What it has not produced is a sophisticated understanding of how to fight an armored system, a combination of tanks and artillery, and aircraft and infantry, and logistics, whose effectiveness derives not from the technical qualities of any individual component, but from the organizational integration of all of them into a combined arms capability that the individual component specifications, assessed in isolation, cannot capture. The Sherman is the most visible component of this system. It is not the most important one. German intelligence, optimized through its methodology to assess the visible component, cannot easily assess the system. November 1942 through February 1943, Tunisia. The Operation Torch landings have brought American armor into the North African theater in the specific quantities that the American transportation system has managed to assemble and deliver, and the German response to the American arrival is producing the first systematic body of after-action assessment of American armored performance that German intelligence has been able to develop from actual combat observation. The Kasserine Pass engagements of February 14 to 25, 1943, the German offensive that drives through the American Second Corps positions and produces the largest American defeat of the North African campaign, are providing to German armored commanders the specific combat data about American armor performance that the pre-war and pre-combat intelligence had not been able to supply. What the Kasserine data suggests to German analysis is initially encouraging. American tank crews are performing below the level of coordination and tactical sophistication that German armored doctrine demands of its own tank crews. Their combined arms integration is incomplete, and their defensive dispositions in the western dorsal's mountain passes have shown the specific vulnerabilities that American tactical inexperience in this theater has produced. But the data from Kasserine is data about one phase of the Tunisian campaign, conducted against American forces whose Second Corps had not yet undergone the specific command transformation that Patton's assumption of command on March 6 will produce, and the analysts reading the Kasserine reports, who conclude that American armor is definitively inferior to German armor, are reading their conclusion from a specific and limited data set that Guettar, a month later, will revise. March 23, 1943. Guettar. The 10th Panzer Division attacks at 0600 hours, advancing into the valley with its Panzer III and IV tanks in the lead, covered by its artillery and its anti-tank gun screens, executing the assault in the specific combined arms formation that German armored doctrine prescribes for an attack against a prepared defensive position. What it encounters is not the defensive response that the Kasserine experience has led the 10th Panzer's commanders to project. The American M4 Shermans in position with the 899th Tank Destroyer Battalion have been pre-registered on the approach routes that the German attack is using, and the specific defensive fire plan that I Corps artillery has established in the valley. The massed American artillery that General Terry Allen's 1st Infantry Division and the supporting Corps artillery have laid to cover the specific terrain that the German attack must cross, opens simultaneously with the 1st German armor crossing the line of departure. The result, in the after-action reports that surviving German commanders file in the days following the engagement, is described with the professional precision of officers who are identifying why their assault did not produce the expected outcome. The American fire is massed in a way that their approach to this engagement had not projected, not in the sense that the Americans have more guns than the German estimate assumed, but in the sense that those guns are integrated in a fire plan whose coordination and execution at the specific moment of the assault's commitment exceeds what the Kasserine experience had demonstrated was the American Army's capability at that stage of the Tunisian campaign. The artillery-tank-infantry integration in the American defensive scheme exceeds what Kasserine had demonstrated, and the Shermans in the defensive scheme are performing at a level of combined arms effectiveness that the individual vehicle's technical specifications, taken in isolation, do not capture. A Sherman at Guettar is not the Sherman of the technical specification document in Berlin. It is a Sherman whose crew is receiving real-time radio guidance from the infantry positions to its left, and whose ammunition supply is being maintained by a logistics system that is functioning more effectively than the Kasserine campaign's rushed deployment allowed, in a defensive scheme that has been prepared for 8 days rather than improvised in hours. The 10th Panzer loses 30 tanks at Guettar. The German assault fails. The after-action report goes north, through Rommel's Army Group Africa headquarters, to OKW in Berlin, where Guderian is attempting to synthesize the Tunisian campaign data into the revised armored doctrine that the 1943 and 1944 campaigns will test. The near failure in the German armored intelligence assessment, the moment that comes closest to producing the correct evaluation of American armor from the available Tunisian data before the campaign in which that evaluation would most matter, arrives in the spring of 1943, when German analysts at Foreign Armies West attempt to synthesize the Tunisia campaign's combat data into a revised assessment of American armored capability that the subsequent Allied operations in Sicily and Italy, and eventually France, will be planned against. The synthesis is not wrong in its technical components. The Sherman's armor and gun specifications are accurately described in the revised assessment, and the assessment correctly identifies the specific tactical limitations that Kasserine had demonstrated were present in American armored operations at that time. What the synthesis underweights, in the judgment of subsequent historical analysis and in the specific terms of Guderian's own post-war reflection on what German intelligence had missed about American armor, is the organizational and industrial context, the rate at which American armored doctrine is improving as operational experience accumulates, the rate of doctrinal learning that the Army's after-action review process and the Army Ground Forces training system have been producing, the specific improvement from the Kasserine standard to the Guettar standard in 11 days that a command change has produced, and the further improvement from the Guettar standard to the Sicily standard to the Normandy standard that the subsequent campaigns have produced in American armored units that are training on their own combat experience rather than on peacetime theoretical frameworks. The rate at which American armor production is replacing losses at a pace that German armor production cannot match. The production differential, whose operational consequence is that the American armored force in France, in the summer of 1944, is not being consumed by the same rate of attrition that is consuming German armored strength, because the replacement rate on the American side keeps pace with the loss rate in a way that the German replacement rate does not. And the specific command transformation that the American Army's institutional willingness to relieve commanders who fail and replace them with commanders whose performance is better, the Fredendall to Patton transition that the Kasserine disaster produced, the 2nd Armored Division's command transitions in the Sicilian campaign, the series of command changes at corps and division level in the Normandy fighting, is producing in American armored units a quality of combined arms performance that the Kasserine assessment has underestimated as a potential rather than as an achieved capability. German intelligence can count the tanks. It cannot count the learning rate. And the learning rate, the specific and documented American institutional capacity for translating combat failure into revised doctrine and revised training and revised command selection, faster than the German analysis has projected, is the variable that makes the Kasserine to Guettar transformation possible in 11 days, the Guettar to Normandy transformation possible in 14 months, and the Normandy to final victory transformation inevitable in 9 months of continuous combat against the most capable German armored formations that remain in the theater. The operational consequence of the German intelligence assessment's specific gaps, the gap between what the Sherman's technical specifications indicated and what the operational deployment of Shermans in the American combined arms system produced, becomes most visible in the Normandy campaign of June and July 1944, when Guderian is receiving the reports of the first encounters between German armored formations and American forces in France. The Shermans that 2nd Corps has been fighting in Tunisia in March 1943 have been replaced by Shermans whose doctrine has been revised by 2 additional years of operational experience, and whose crews have been trained to the specific standard that the combined arms integration of the American Armored Division, refined through Sicily and Italy, now produces. Guderian's assessments of the Normandy fighting, available in the operational communications he sends to OKW as Inspector General of Armored Troops, and in the personal notes that inform Panzer leader, describe a gap between the pre-Normandy German assessment of American armored capability and the American armored performance that Normandy's combat is demonstrating that Guderian attributes to the specific qualities that the intelligence assessments had not been able to fully capture. The American ability to replace losses faster than German armor can destroy them. The American combined arms integration that makes the individual Sherman's technical limitations less operationally significant than a comparison of tank specifications suggests. And the American logistical system that sustains American armored formations in the field at a rate of operational tempo that German intelligence's assessment of American logistics had not projected as achievable. The Sherman, in Guderian's operational assessment, is not the vehicle that the German intelligence files described, not because the technical specifications are wrong, but because the operational context, the doctrine, the logistics, the numbers, the institutional capacity for rapid improvement, transforms a technically adequate vehicle into a militarily decisive weapon in ways that no static technical assessment of its armor and armament could capture. The legacy of the gap between German intelligence's picture of the Sherman and what the Sherman actually represented in the operational context of the 1943 to 1945 campaigns is not primarily a legacy of intelligence failure in the conventional sense of the term, a failure to obtain accurate information about the enemy's capabilities. It is a legacy of analytical framework failure, the failure of an intelligence assessment methodology built around the technical specification comparison of individual weapon systems to capture the operational context that makes a specific weapon decisive. The Sherman is technically inferior to the Panther in most parameters that German armored doctrine identifies as primary. Armor protection, main gun penetration at long range, individual crew survivability, in the specific condition of a penetrating hit on a vehicle that lacks the Panther's armor, and the Sherman's fire risk from the gasoline, in its hull sponsons, amplifies the survivability disadvantage. German armored doctrine, built through decades of theoretical development and refined through years of combat, identifies these parameters as primary because they are the parameters that determine the outcome of the individual tank versus tank engagement in the specific combat conditions for which German armored doctrine has been optimizing. The Sherman wins the armored campaign in the Western theater, not because those parameters turn out to be wrong in the abstract, but because the parameters are not the correct variables for predicting the operational outcome of an armored campaign conducted at the scale and with the logistical and institutional context that the American military brings to the 1944 and 1945 operations. In a one-on-one engagement on a flat field at 1,000 meters, the Panther kills the Sherman with high reliability, and the Sherman kills the Panther with low reliability. In the actual operational campaign of 1944 and 1945, the Sherman appears at a ratio to the Panther that reflects the American production system's output and the German production system's output, and that ratio makes the one-on-one comparison operationally irrelevant to the campaign's outcome. German intelligence assessed the one-on-one comparison accurately. It assessed the production ratio accurately in its static form. What it did not assess accurately was the interaction between the production ratio and the logistical system that sustained the Sherman's operational availability, and the interaction between both of those factors and the American institutional capacity for rapid doctrinal improvement. Guderian's Panzer Leader, published in 1950 in German and in English translation in 1952, one of the most widely read military memoirs of the Second World War, and a document that shaped the post-war Western military understanding of armored warfare in specific and lasting ways, addresses this failure of analytical framework with the specific professional honesty of a man who built his career on understanding armored warfare and who has been confronted by an opponent who played by different rules than the rules he understood the game by. The book is honest about the German failures and analytical about their causes in ways that post-war military memoir rarely achieves, and one of its recurring themes, the gap between what German intelligence told the German command about Allied capabilities and what those capabilities actually demonstrated in combat, is addressed with the specific analytical precision of a man who has spent years thinking about why the gap existed and what its operational consequences were. The American armored force did not win by building a better tank. It won by building more tanks, by supplying them better, by training their crews in combined arms operations with artillery and infantry and air support, and by developing at every level of its officer corps the specific willingness to learn from failure and apply what was learned faster than German armored doctrine's rigidities permitted comparable learning on the German side. The Sherman was not what Guderian's intelligence reports described, because the intelligence reports described a vehicle, and the vehicle was only part of what the Americans had built. What the Americans had built was a system, a production system, a logistics system, a combined arms doctrine system, a command development system, and the Sherman was the most visible component of it. The visible component was never the most important one. The system was, and that is what no intelligence report, however accurate about the vehicle, was equipped to capture. Because the intelligence methodology that German military intelligence had developed was a methodology for assessing components, not systems. And the American armored force was a system, in a way that the German armored force, despite its operational sophistication, was not. The German Panzer arm was built around the excellence of its individual components, the tactical skill of its crews, the engineering quality of its vehicles, the professional competence of its commanders. The American armored force was built around the integration of its system components, the production system that generated more vehicles than the German production system, the logistics system that sustained more of them in the field, the training system that produced crews faster, and the doctrinal learning system that improved the integration of all of them faster than German armored doctrine could respond to what it was encountering. Guderian understood this difference in retrospect. He identified it in Panzer leader, with the specific clarity of a man who has spent years thinking about why he lost a war he had expected to win. The intelligence reports had described the vehicle. They had missed the system. And in the specific and decisive difference between those two things lies the most important lesson that the armored warfare of the Second World War has to offer to any military institution that is tempted to assess its opponent's capability by examining only what it can most easily measure.